In the dust-choked town of Millbrook, where secrets buried themselves deeper than gold veins and trust was as scarce as rain, Sheriff Thomas Wade thought he knew every soul, every sin, and every shadow that danced through his streets. For 15 years, he had been the steady hand that kept order, the calm voice that settled disputes, and the unwavering presence that folks counted on when darkness fell. But, on this particular morning, as the sun painted the desert sky in shades of amber and blood, Thomas would discover that the person he trusted most in this world had been living a lie so devastating, so completely unthinkable, that it would shatter not just his faith in humanity, but his very understanding of right and wrong. What began as a routine morning would end with Thomas staring into the face of evil itself, wearing the smile of someone he loved. Thomas Wade adjusted his worn leather hat as he stepped out of the small jailhouse that had been his second home for the past decade and a half. The morning air carried the familiar scent of dust, horse sweat, and the faint aroma of coffee brewing at Martha's Diner down the street. At 52, Thomas had seen enough of life to know that peaceful mornings like this one were precious gifts not to be taken lightly. Millbrook wasn't much to look at from the outside. A collection of weathered wooden buildings, a main street that turned to mud whenever it rained, and perhaps 200 souls trying to make an honest living in the harsh embrace of the Arizona Territory. But, to Thomas, it was home, and, more importantly, it was his responsibility. Every person who walked these dusty streets, every family that called this place home, fell under his protection. He walked slowly toward the center of town, his boots creating small clouds of dust with each step. Mrs. Henderson was already hanging her laundry behind the general store, and young Billy Morrison was leading their milk cow toward the small pasture on the edge of town. Normal sights, normal sounds, normal life continuing as it had for years. Thomas had always taken pride in knowing his community. He knew that old Pete drank too much on Saturdays but was harmless, that the widow Johnson struggled to make ends meet but was too proud to accept direct charity, and that the traveling merchant who came through twice a month watered down his whiskey but told stories worth the price of a drink. These were his people, and their troubles were his troubles. The sun was climbing higher when Thomas noticed a stranger riding into town. Nothing unusual about that travelers passed through Millbrook regularly, some heading west toward California, others moving east toward more settled territories. But something about this particular rider caught his attention. The man sat his horse with the easy confidence of someone comfortable with violence, and his clothes, while dusty from travel, were of better quality than most drifters could afford. Thomas positioned himself casually near the hitching post outside Martha's Diner, where he could observe without appearing too interested. The stranger dismounted with fluid grace, tied his horse with practiced efficiency, and looked around the town with calculating eyes. When those eyes met Thomas's, the man nodded politely and approached. "Sheriff Wade, I presume?" The stranger's voice carried a slight accent that Thomas couldn't quite place. "I'm Detective James Morrison from Tucson. I wonder if I might have a word with you." Thomas studied the man's face, noting the serious expression and the way his hand rested casually near his gun. "Of course, Detective. What brings you to Millbrook?" Morrison glanced around at the few people visible on the street, then back to Thomas. "Perhaps we could speak privately? I have some questions about one of your residents, and the matter is somewhat delicate." They walked back toward the jailhouse, Thomas's mind already working through possibilities. In his experience, when outside law enforcement came asking questions, it usually meant trouble for someone. He hoped it wasn't anything too serious, though the detective's formal manner suggested it might be. Inside the small office, Morrison declined the offer of coffee and got straight to business. He pulled out a leather folder and extracted several documents, spreading them on Thomas's desk with careful precision. "Sheriff, I'm investigating a series of bank robberies that have occurred across the territory over the past 2 years. 5 banks in total, with a combined loss of nearly $30,000. Morrison's finger traced across a map showing the locations. The robberies show a pattern of careful planning and inside knowledge of each bank's operations. Thomas leaned forward, studying the papers. "That's a considerable sum. I take it you have some leads?" "We do." Morrison's expression grew even more serious. "The evidence points to someone with connections to multiple communities, someone who travels regularly and would have opportunities to observe banking operations without arousing suspicion. The detective pulled out another document, and Thomas recognized it as a wanted poster, though the face was turned away from him. "Sheriff, I need to ask you about someone who's been living in your town for several years."
"Someone you know well."
Something cold settled in Thomas's stomach. The way Morrison was building up to this revelation, the careful phrasing, the serious tone, all of it suggested that this wasn't going to be a conversation about some drifter or troublemaker.
This was about someone Thomas considered trustworthy. "Who are you asking about?"
Thomas's voice remained steady, but his hand moved instinctively closer to his gun. Morrison turned the wanted poster around, and Thomas felt the world shift beneath him. The face staring back at him was familiar, beloved even. It was his deputy, Marcus Chen, the young man he had trained, trusted, and, come to think of, almost as a son. "This can't be right," Thomas said, his voice barely above a whisper.
"Marcus has been with me for 3 years.
He's honest, reliable, dedicated to the job.
There has to be some mistake." Morrison's expression showed sympathy, but his voice remained professional.
"I understand this is difficult, Sheriff. But the evidence is substantial. We have witness descriptions from 3 of the robberies that match your deputy perfectly.
More importantly, we have this."
The detective produced a small silver watch, ornate and distinctive. Thomas recognized it immediately. It had belonged to Marcus's father, or so Marcus had claimed. The young man wore it every day, often checking it with obvious pride. This watch was found at the scene of the robbery in Phoenix 6 months ago. The bank manager there provided a detailed description of one of the robbers, and it matches your deputy in every particular. Height, build, distinctive scar on his left hand, and, most notably, this exact watch.
Thomas picked up the watch with trembling hands.
He had seen Marcus polish it countless times, had heard the story of how it was the only thing he had left of his family. Now that touching story seemed like just another lie in what was apparently a web of deception. "There's more," Morrison continued gently. "We've tracked the timing of the robberies with your deputy's reported activities. Each one occurred during periods when he claimed to be visiting family or taking personal time. And, in each case, he returned to Millbrook with small amounts of money that he claimed came from odd jobs or family gifts."
The detective spread out a timeline that made the pattern undeniably clear. Every robbery coincided perfectly with Marcus's absences from town.
What Thomas had seen as a young man maintaining family connections was actually a criminal using those trips as cover for increasingly bold crimes. Furthermore, Morrison added, "We have reason to believe he's been using his position as your deputy to gather information about potential targets. The Millbrook Bank has been cased recently, and we believe it may be his next target." Thomas felt as if the ground was crumbling beneath his feet. Marcus had been more than just a deputy, he had been like family. Thomas had taught him everything about law enforcement, had trusted him with his life on numerous occasions, had even begun thinking about recommending him as his replacement when the time came to retire. "I need proof," Thomas said finally, his voice hoarse with emotion.
"Real proof, not just circumstantial evidence and coincidences." Morrison nodded understandingly.
"That's why I'm here, Sheriff.
We need your help to catch him in the act.
Our information suggests he's planning to rob the Millbrook Bank tomorrow night. We want to set up a trap." The weight of betrayal settled heavily on Thomas's shoulders. Not only had he been completely deceived by someone he trusted, but that someone had been planning to rob his own town's bank, potentially endangering the people Thomas had sworn to protect.
"What do you need me to do?"
Thomas asked, the words tasting bitter in his mouth.
Morrison outlined the plan.
They would set up surveillance around the bank, but, more importantly, they needed Thomas to act normally around Marcus, to give no indication that they suspected anything. It would be crucial to catch the deputy in the act, with enough evidence to ensure a conviction.
"Can you do it, Sheriff? Can you pretend everything is normal when you see him?"
Thomas looked at the evidence spread across his desk, then, out the window toward the town he had protected for so many years. Somewhere out there, Marcus was probably going about his daily routine, playing the role of the dedicated deputy while planning to rob the very people who trusted him. "I'll do what needs to be done," Thomas said quietly.
"But, I want to understand why. Marcus never seemed to want for anything.
I paid him fairly, the town accepted him, he had a future here.
Why throw it all away?
Morrison began gathering his papers. In my experience, Sheriff, people rarely commit crimes like this purely for money. There's usually something deeper: greed, revenge, or sometimes just the thrill of the deception itself.
Maybe your deputy enjoyed fooling everyone, enjoyed knowing he was living a double life right under your nose.
As the detective prepared to leave, Thomas remained seated at his desk, staring at the watch that had seemed like such a treasured family heirloom. Now it looked like evidence of betrayal, a prop in an elaborate performance that had fooled him completely. "Detective Morrison," Thomas called as the man reached the door.
"How long have you suspected Marcus?"
Morrison paused, his hand on the doorknob.
"We've been building this case for 8 months, Sheriff."
"I'm sorry it took us this long to piece it together. If we had moved faster, perhaps we could have prevented some of the later robberies." After Morrison left, Thomas sat alone in his office, the evidence of Marcus's crimes scattered before him. In a few hours, his deputy would return from his rounds, would smile and joke and act the part of the loyal lawman he had never actually been. And Thomas would have to do the same, pretending that his world hadn't just been turned upside down. The afternoon stretched ahead of him like a prison sentence, each minute bringing him closer to a confrontation he dreaded but knew was inevitable. Marcus Chen, the young man he had trained and trusted, was not who he appeared to be. And, tomorrow night, Thomas would have to help bring down someone he had come to love like a son. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Thomas realized that this morning's peaceful routine had been the last normal moment he might know for a very long time. The calm reassurance he had felt about his life, his community, and his judgment had been shattered by a shocking discovery that would change everything. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on Millbrook's main street as Thomas tried to go about his normal routine. Every familiar face he encountered seemed different now, viewed through the lens of his new knowledge about deception and betrayal. If Marcus could fool him so completely, what other secrets might be hiding behind the friendly smiles and daily greetings of his neighbors? He was checking the locks on the bank when he heard familiar footsteps approaching from behind. His muscles tensed involuntarily as he recognized the easy gait of his deputy. For a moment, Thomas considered turning around and confronting Marcus immediately, demanding answers, explanations, anything that might make sense of this nightmare. Instead, he forced himself to breathe slowly and turn with what he hoped looked like his usual calm demeanor. "Afternoon, Sheriff," Marcus called out cheerfully, his dark eyes bright with what seemed like genuine warmth.
"Quiet day so far."
"I checked on the Henderson place like you asked, and old Pete's behaving himself for once." Thomas studied his deputy's face, searching for any sign of guilt, deception, or malice.
He found none.
Marcus looked exactly as he always did: competent, respectful, genuinely concerned with doing his job well. The performance was flawless, which made it all the more chilling. "Good work, Marcus," Thomas managed, his voice sounding almost normal.
"Anything else I should know about?"
Marcus shifted his weight slightly, and Thomas noticed the unconscious gesture he had observed hundreds of times before. The young man's hand moved toward his pocket, where he kept that silver watch. The watch that was now sitting in an evidence box in Thomas's desk drawer, having been found at a crime scene 200 miles away. "Well, there is one thing," Marcus said, and Thomas felt his heart rate increase.
"I was wondering if I could take tomorrow night off."
"I know it's short notice, but I just received word that my aunt in Phoenix is very ill."
"Family is important, you know?"
The lie came so smoothly, delivered with such apparent sincerity, that Thomas almost believed it himself.
This was the same story Marcus had used before, variations of family obligations that required him to leave town at crucial moments. Now Thomas understood that each of these family emergencies had been cover for robberies across the territory. "Of course," Thomas replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Family comes first."
"I hope your aunt recovers quickly." Marcus smiled, and Thomas saw what looked like genuine gratitude in his expression.
"Thank you, Sheriff. I really appreciate your understanding. I should be back the day after tomorrow."
The casual way Marcus planned his alibis, the comfortable lies that rolled off his tongue, the complete absence of any visible guilt, it was like looking at a stranger wearing the face of someone he had trusted. Thomas realized that in 3 years of working together, he had never truly known Marcus Chen at all. After Marcus left to complete his evening rounds, Thomas returned to his office and found Detective Morrison waiting in the shadows beside the building. The two men moved inside quickly, and Thomas locked the door behind them.
"How did it go?" Morrison asked quietly. "Exactly as you predicted," Thomas replied, slumping into his chair. "He just asked for tomorrow night off, claimed family emergency in Phoenix."
"Same story he's used before."
Morrison nodded grimly.
"It's a pattern we've seen with other criminals who maintain legitimate positions. They become very comfortable with their deception, sometimes even convinced that they're cleverer than everyone around them." Thomas pulled out the evidence Morrison had left behind and spread it across his desk again, studying it with new eyes.
"Help me understand something, Detective. How did he choose his targets?"
"These banks are spread across hundreds of miles, in towns that don't seem to have much in common."
Morrison pointed to locations on the map.
"That's where your deputy's intelligence gathering comes into play. Each of these banks had specific vulnerabilities that would only be apparent to someone with law enforcement knowledge. Weak locks, predictable guard schedules, poor lighting around the building.
Someone would need to spend considerable time observing each location to identify these weaknesses."
And Marcus had the perfect cover story, Thomas realized with growing horror.
Family visits, personal business, legitimate reasons to travel that no one would question. Exactly.
And, as a deputy sheriff, he could ask questions about local security, banking procedures, even examine locks and safes under the pretense of official business. Bank managers would actually help him plan their own robberies without realizing it. Thomas thought about all the times Marcus had shown interest in law enforcement techniques, had asked detailed questions about security procedures, had volunteered for duties that involved interacting with local businesses. What he had interpreted as professional dedication was actually criminal research. "There's something else you should know," Morrison continued, pulling out another document.
"We believe Marcus isn't working alone.
The scale of these operations, the precise timing, the ability to move stolen money without detection, it suggests a larger organization." The detective showed Thomas sketches of other suspects, men who had been seen in the vicinity of various robberies but never clearly identified.
"We think Marcus may be part of a gang that specializes in using legitimate positions to gather intelligence.
There could be others like him in towns across the territory, all feeding information to a central organization."
Thomas felt sick.
Not only had he been completely deceived by Marcus, but his deputy might be part of a criminal network that was using law enforcement positions to commit crimes.
The betrayal went deeper than personal trust. It was an assault on the very concept of justice. "What's the plan for tomorrow night?" Thomas asked. Morrison spread out a detailed map of the town, marking positions around the bank.
"We'll have men positioned here, here, and here," he pointed to strategic locations. "But the key is that you need to be visible elsewhere, giving Marcus confidence that he won't be interrupted." "You want me to abandon my post while my own deputy robs the bank?" "I want you to help us catch a dangerous criminal who has been using your trust and your badge to commit serious crimes," Morrison replied firmly.
"This isn't about abandoning anything, Sheriff. This is about justice."
Thomas knew the detective was right, but the emotional weight of the situation was overwhelming. Tomorrow night, he would watch from hiding as someone he had mentored and cared about revealed their true nature. It felt like a form of torture.
"There's one more thing," Morrison said quietly.
"We need to consider the possibility that Marcus' suspects were onto him. Criminal organizations like this often have ways of detecting law enforcement interest.
If he runs tonight instead of attempting the robbery tomorrow, we might lose him forever." Thomas hadn't considered that possibility.
The thought of Marcus simply disappearing, never facing justice for his crimes, was almost unbearable. All those banks he had robbed, all the people he had stolen from, the trust he had violated, it couldn't all be for nothing.
"What can I do to prevent that?" "Act normally. If anything, be slightly more trusting than usual.
Make him feel secure in his deception. And watch for any signs that he might be preparing to leave permanently rather than temporarily." The evening passed with agonizing slowness. Thomas made his usual rounds, checked in with local businesses, and exchanged pleasantries with townspeople, all while his mind churned with the knowledge of what was coming. Every interaction felt like a performance, and he wondered if this was how Marcus had felt for the past 3 years, constantly acting, constantly deceiving. When he returned to the jailhouse near sunset, he found Marcus completing paperwork with his usual diligence.
The young man looked up with a smile that seemed completely genuine.
"Everything quiet tonight, Sheriff. I've got the patrol reports finished and filed."
"Is there anything else you need before I head home?" Thomas almost broke then.
The casual normalcy of the moment, the respectful tone, the apparent dedication to duty, it was all so perfectly performed that he wanted to scream. Instead, he managed to nod.
"That's fine, Marcus. Get some rest before your trip tomorrow."
"I hope everything goes well with your family situation." Marcus stood and gathered his things, pausing at the door as if he wanted to say something more. For a moment, Thomas hoped for some sign of conscience, some crack in the facade that might indicate remorse or internal conflict. "Sheriff," Marcus said finally, "I want you to know how much I've appreciated working with you these past 3 years. You've taught me everything I know about being a lawman, and I'll never forget that."
The words hit Thomas like physical blows.
Even this apparent gratitude was part of the deception, a calculated performance designed to maintain his cover. Or worse, maybe Marcus genuinely felt grateful while simultaneously planning to betray everything Thomas had taught him. "You're a good deputy, Marcus," Thomas replied, the words catching in his throat.
"I'm proud of the man you've become."
After Marcus left, Thomas sat alone in his office as darkness fell over Millbrook. The familiar sounds of the evening, the distant laughter from the saloon, the barking of dogs, the closing of shop doors seemed muted and strange. Tomorrow night would bring the end of his relationship with Marcus, the end of his faith in his own judgment, and, quite possibly, the end of his career as sheriff. Detective Morrison appeared at his door as the clock struck 9. "How are you holding up, Sheriff?" Thomas looked up from his desk, where he had been staring at Marcus's personnel file.
3 years of exemplary service records, commendations from grateful citizens, recommendations for advancement. All of it meaningless now.
"I keep thinking about signs I should have seen," Thomas admitted. "Little things that might have warned me, if I had been paying attention." "Don't do that to yourself," Morrison said firmly. "Professional criminals like Marcus Chan are experts at deception. They study normal behavior and mimic it perfectly. The fact that he fooled you doesn't reflect poorly on your abilities as a sheriff, it demonstrates how skilled he is at manipulation." Thomas nodded, but the guilt remained. His job was to protect the people of Millbrook, and he had unknowingly given a criminal access to their community, their trust, and their vulnerabilities. "Tomorrow night will be difficult," Morrison continued, "but remember that you're not just catching a bank robber. You're stopping someone who has violated one of the most sacred trusts in society, the bond between a lawman and the people he serves." As the detective left, Thomas remained at his desk, preparing for what might be the longest day of his life. Tomorrow, the calm reassurance that had defined his world would be replaced by the shocking reality of betrayal. And, somewhere in the darkness beyond his window, Marcus Chan was probably planning the crime that would finally reveal his true nature to the world. The next day crawled by with the slow torture of inevitability. Thomas went through his routine like a man walking to his own execution, every familiar task now weighted with the knowledge of what the evening would bring. He made small talk with shopkeepers, settled a minor dispute between neighbors, and checked on the widow Johnson, all while his mind remained fixed on the approaching confrontation with Marcus. By mid-afternoon, his deputy had completed his regular duties and stopped by the office to bid Thomas farewell before his supposed trip to Phoenix. Marcus seemed relaxed, even cheerful, chatting about the weather and expressing hope that his aunt's condition would improve. The performance was so convincing that Thomas found himself momentarily wondering if Detective Morrison had made a terrible mistake. "Take care of yourself, Marcus," Thomas said as his deputy prepared to leave. "And don't worry about things here. I can handle the town for a couple of days." Marcus paused at the door, his hand resting on the frame. "Sheriff, I know I don't say this often enough, but working with you has been the best thing that ever happened to me. You gave me a chance when nobody else would, and I'll never forget that kindness." The words seemed so sincere, delivered with such apparent emotion, that Thomas felt his resolve waver. This young man had eaten dinner at his table, had helped him repair his fence, had listened to his stories about the old days with what seemed like genuine interest.
Could all of that have been an act?
After Marcus left, presumably to prepare for his journey, Thomas met with Detective Morrison and his men to review the final details of their trap. Morrison had brought 3 additional officers from Tucson, all experienced in dealing with organized criminal operations. They would position themselves around the bank while Thomas maintained a visible presence at the opposite end of town, providing Marcus with the confidence he needed to attempt the robbery. Remember, Morrison emphasized, we need to catch him in the act. If he approaches the bank but doesn't actually attempt to break in, we don't have enough for a conviction.
He has to commit the crime. Thomas nodded, understanding the legal requirements but dreading what it meant. He would have to let Marcus actually begin robbing the Millbrook Bank before they could intervene.
The money Marcus would be stealing belonged to his friends and neighbors, people who had trusted Thomas to protect them.
As evening approached, Thomas took up his assigned position near the saloon at the far end of town. From there, he could be seen by anyone who might be watching, but he had a clear view of the street leading to the bank. Morrison and his men had already disappeared into their hiding spots, invisible but ready to act. The sun set with its usual dramatic display of colors, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple that Thomas had always found beautiful. Tonight, the beauty felt mocking, as if nature was indifferent to the human drama about to unfold. He checked his pocket watch for the 20th time, noting that it was nearly 9 o'clock. Then, he saw movement in the shadows near the bank. A figure emerged from the alley behind the building, moving with the careful stealth of someone who didn't want to be observed. Even in the darkness, Thomas recognized the distinctive silhouette of his deputy. Marcus approached the bank's rear entrance with practiced efficiency. He had clearly studied the building extensively, knowing exactly which shadows would conceal his movements and which angles would be invisible from the main street. Thomas watched in fascination and horror as his trusted deputy produced a set of lockpicks and began working on the door with obvious expertise. This wasn't the fumbling attempt of an amateur or desperate criminal. Marcus moved like a professional, someone who had done this many times before. The revelation was both shocking and oddly relieving. Thomas's faith in his own judgment hadn't been completely misplaced. Marcus truly was skilled, just not in the ways Thomas had believed. The lock yielded quickly to Marcus's tools, and he slipped inside the bank with barely a sound. Thomas knew that Detective Morrison and his men were watching from their positions, waiting for Marcus to actually take money before moving to arrest him. The next few minutes would determine whether 3 years of trust and mentorship had been completely wasted. Inside the bank, Marcus moved with the confidence of someone who knew exactly where to find what he was looking for. Thomas had often discussed the bank's security measures with Marcus, sharing information that he now realized had been used to plan this very crime. The bitter irony was overwhelming. Marcus was succeeding partially because of what Thomas himself had taught him. A light appeared briefly in the bank's main room, probably from a small lantern that Marcus had brought with him. Thomas could see the faint glow moving around the building's interior as his deputy located the safe and began working on it. This was taking longer than the door lock, but Marcus seemed unhurried, confident in his ability to complete the job without interruption. Thomas found himself hoping that Marcus would somehow realize what he was doing was wrong, would abandon the robbery and leave the bank empty-handed. It was a foolish hope, but the alternative, accepting that someone he cared about was truly criminal, was almost too painful to bear. The light went out suddenly, and Thomas knew that Marcus had succeeded in opening the safe. In a few minutes, his deputy would emerge from the bank carrying stolen money, and Detective Morrison would give the signal to close the trap. The deception that had lasted 3 years would finally end. Marcus appeared at the bank's front door, moving more quickly now but still cautiously. He had a leather satchel slung over his shoulder, undoubtedly containing whatever money he had been able to steal from the safe. As he stepped into the street, he looked directly toward Thomas's position, checking to make sure the sheriff was still occupied at the other end of town. For a moment, their eyes seemed to meet across the distance and darkness. Thomas wondered what Marcus saw when he looked at him. A fool who had been easily deceived? A mentor whose teachings had been perverted for criminal purposes? Or simply an obstacle to be managed and manipulated?
Morrison's whistle shrilled through the night air, and, suddenly, the street erupted with activity. 3 men emerged from concealment around the bank, their guns drawn and pointed at Marcus. Thomas saw his deputy's face clearly in the moonlight as the young man realized he had been caught. The expression Thomas saw there wasn't surprise, fear, or remorse. It was calculation. Even trapped with overwhelming evidence against him, Marcus was already working out angles, planning his next move. The realization struck Thomas like a physical blow. This young man felt no guilt about what he had done, no regret for the trust he had betrayed.
"Drop the bag and put your hands up,"
Morrison shouted from his position near the bank's entrance.
"You're under arrest."
For a moment, Marcus seemed to consider his options. His hand moved toward his gun, and Thomas felt a surge of panic. If Marcus chose to fight, people might be killed, and Thomas knew that some of the blood would be on his hands for training the deputy so well. Instead, Marcus slowly raised his hands, letting the leather satchel fall to the ground. Even in surrender, he maintained the calm demeanor that had made him such an effective deputy. Thomas realized that this composure wasn't natural character, it was the practiced skill of someone who had been caught before and knew how to minimize the consequences. "Sheriff Wade," Marcus called out across the distance, his voice carrying clearly in the still night air.
"I suppose you're going to want an explanation."
Thomas walked slowly toward the group gathered around his former deputy, each step feeling like a year of his life. When he reached them, he looked directly into Marcus's face, searching one last time for some sign of the young man he had trusted and trained. "I don't think I want to hear it," Thomas replied quietly.
"I don't think anything you could say would make this easier to understand."
Marcus shrugged, a gesture so familiar from their daily interactions that it was painful to witness.
"Fair enough. Though I will say this, you taught me well, Sheriff.
Everything I know about reading people, about planning operations, about staying calm under pressure I learned from you." The words were obviously intended to wound, and they succeeded. Thomas felt personally responsible not just for failing to detect Marcus's criminal activities, but for actually enabling them through his training and trust.
Detective Morrison stepped forward with handcuffs.
"Marcus Chen, you're under arrest for bank robbery, theft, and conspiracy.
You have the right to remain silent."
As Morrison recited the formal charges, Thomas opened the leather satchel that Marcus had dropped. Inside was nearly $3,000 in bills and gold coins, money that belonged to the hard-working people of Millbrook. More evidence, if any were needed, of how completely he had been deceived. "Sheriff," Morrison said quietly, "we need to search his residence and belongings. There might be evidence linking him to the other robberies, or information about his accomplices."
Thomas nodded, though the thought of going through Marcus's personal possessions felt like a violation of privacy.
Then, he reminded himself that privacy was something Marcus had forfeited when he chose to become a criminal. They walked to the small cabin behind the jailhouse that had served as Marcus's home for 3 years. Thomas had helped him move in, had shared meals there, had considered it a symbol of Marcus's integration into the community. Now it looked like what it apparently had always been, a criminal's hideout. Inside, they found evidence that painted a picture of systematic deception spanning years. Hidden beneath the floorboards was a metal box containing nearly $8,000 in cash, along with detailed maps of banks across the territory. There were also letters written in code, presumably correspondence with Marcus's criminal associates. Most damning of all was a leather journal containing Marcus's own notes about the people and businesses of Millbrook. Thomas recognized his own handwriting in some of the margins, where Marcus had recorded information Thomas had shared during casual conversations. Every piece of local knowledge Thomas had passed along had been catalogued and evaluated for criminal potential. He was planning to rob every business in town eventually, Morrison observed, reading through the journal.
The bank was just the beginning.
Thomas found a section of the journal devoted to his own daily routines, noting his patrol schedule, his habits, and his weaknesses. Marcus had been studying him as carefully as he had studied the bank, preparing to exploit every aspect of their relationship. Near the bottom of the hidden cash box was a small photograph of a woman Thomas didn't recognize. On the back was written Rose Marie, Denver, 1873. Thomas wondered if this represented genuine feeling on Marcus's part, or if even his personal relationships had been calculated deceptions. "Sheriff," Morrison said, holding up one of the coded letters, "this suggests that there are at least 6 other operatives working in different towns across the territory.
This is a much larger operation than we initially suspected."
Thomas sat heavily in one of Marcus's chairs, surrounded by evidence of betrayal that went far deeper than he had imagined. Not only had his deputy been a criminal, but he had been part of an organized network that specialized in infiltrating law enforcement agencies.
"How many other sheriffs are going through what I'm experiencing tonight?" Thomas asked. Morrison's expression was grim.
"Based on this evidence, probably several. And some of them might not be as fortunate as you are to discover the truth before more serious damage is done. They spent the rest of the night cataloging evidence and preparing reports that would be sent to law enforcement agencies across the territory." Thomas learned that Marcus Chen probably wasn't even his deputy's real name, that the stories about his family were completely fabricated, and that his supposed background in Missouri was entirely fictional. As dawn broke over Millbrook, Thomas stood in the doorway of his jailhouse and watched Detective Morrison's wagon disappear into the distance, carrying Marcus and the evidence of his crimes back to Tucson for trial. The town was waking up to what seemed like a normal day, unaware that their deputy sheriff had been arrested for planning to rob them. Thomas knew he would have to explain the situation to his community, would have to face their questions about how he had been so completely fooled. Some would lose faith in his judgment, and he wouldn't blame them. He had lost faith in it himself. But, as he looked out over the dusty street where he had walked thousands of times before, Thomas realized that something valuable had survived the night's revelations.
His commitment to protecting Millbrook and its people remained unchanged, perhaps even strengthened by the experience of betrayal.
The calm reassurance he had felt about his world was gone forever, replaced by a more complex understanding of human nature and the masks people could wear. But the shocking discovery of Marcus's true nature had also revealed something important about himself. Thomas's dedication to justice was stronger than his need to trust, and his love for his community was deeper than his personal pain. He walked back into his office and began writing the reports that would officially close this chapter of his life. Outside, Millbrook continued its daily routine, secure in the knowledge that their sheriff was watching over them. Thomas intended to make sure that trust was never misplaced again, no matter what it cost him personally. The morning sun climbed higher into the desert sky, promising another day of heat and dust and the endless challenge of keeping order in a hard land. Thomas Waite straightened his hat, checked his gun, and prepared to face whatever came next. He had been deceived once, but he would be wiser now. The people of Millbrook deserved nothing less than his complete dedication to their safety, and that was exactly what they would receive.